For this first lecture in organizational communication, we're going to work to set a foundation. Once we've set this foundation, we'll take time to look back at history and theory that brought us to this foundation, and also to look at contemporary issues that are leading us into the future as change inside of organizations evolve. So what is an organization? We want to develop a very clear definition of what we're talking about and talk about where some of the fuzzy areas might be inside of that clear definition. So an organization is a collection of individuals working interdependently within a structured system to achieve common goals. The interesting thing about where we are socially now with the movement towards remote learning and changing and work from home and everything that's happening is that you might be less aware of who the collection of individuals is because you're not physically seeing everyone on a daily basis. But that does not change that that's what makes up the organization itself, is that collection of individuals. The reason why it is important to stay aware of who those people and players are is because they work interdependently. Interdependence, which we talk about in many different contexts inside of communication, means that the actions of one affect another. So what you do impacts what somebody else is doing, just like what you don't do might impact what somebody else is doing. And those impacts differ from person to person. I always like to think of interdependence as a watch. Some people might be the band of the watch. If the band is missing, the watch still functions, but not the way it's supposed to, right? You have to put it in your pocket rather than on your wrist. While other people are the battery of the watch. If the battery dies or is missing, technically it's still a watch, but it's completely not functional. So knowing your role inside of that interdependent collection of individuals is important. This is what makes it a structured system. Now, in a later lecture, we'll talk about different types of structures because they do impact how that collection of individuals works. But there should be a structure. You should be able to find and identify who reports to whom and what's going on and where are different departments. And that's what makes up the structured system, all of which should have a common goal. Now, mission statements and goal statements are something, again, we'll talk more about later, but they're probably not a new concept to you, this idea that we should have common goals as an organization. But people's individual goals sometimes differ and can feel out of place with the organizational goal, which can cause a feeling of dissonance from the organization. Now, there are impacts of a global marketplace. We have reached a point in history where it is undeniable that we have global interconnectedness. For me, this was apparent during the pandemic when all of a sudden nobody was able to produce a couch or a refrigerator or a washing machine. I personally waited 9 months for a washer and dryer I had ordered. So even if something is made in America, its components might be coming from somewhere else. This has also led to outsourcing. So an individual company may have some departments that are located one place, other departments that are located another place. So maybe sales and marketing is located in Austin, Texas, but the customer service base is located in another location, which is going to lead us to deeper conversations about both competition and human rights. And these two things can seem to be in conflict. Competition is talking about pricing and beating out the competitor for offering the same or similar service. Human rights is about how do we treat all of the people that work for us in a humane and fair way. Different countries have different standards, and this is not by any means saying that the United States has the best standards for human rights and equal pay. Again, another conversation that we'll talk about in a deeper way on another day, but it is an impact of the global marketplace. when I think about this and this idea of change, versus the status quo. So meaning, are we evolving versus are things as they are good enough and should stay the same way? I go back to this ancient Greek philosophy of change is the only constant in life. I found a beautiful irony of that during these past semesters and years, where people talk about going back to normal. We can't really go back to normal because we live in the now. We live in the normal that currently exists, and the only option we have is to change and create something new. Part of the problem here is that we've politicized progressive practices. So this idea of progressiveness equaling a liberal or conservative nature has become politicized, but progression means forward movement. When I'm running with my run coach and they say we're going to do a progressive run, I know that I'm going to get faster as I go, and there's going to be change in the process. So part of what we're going to try to do during these conversations is depoliticize what we're talking about in order to really dig into the impact of change on an organization. This is a part of this conversation that really excites me as someone who is a generational scholar, and this is something I've looked at and studied in great depth. It was actually part of my PhD work and my dissertation in looking at motivation. When I first put this lecture together, I started with baby boomers because we sometimes don't talk about the silent generation. Even though interesting for myself, my parents were born in 1944 and 1945. So they're actually at the very end of the silent generation. The silent generation was called that primarily because they were expected to be seen and not heard. And this really helps me understand some of the behaviors and attitudes that my parents hold of people's role in life. But as we continue this conversation, it's important to note that when we talk about generational cohorts, we're not talking about the same thing as generations in the family of great-grandparent, grandparent, parent, and child. That's not what we're talking about with generational cohorts. We're talking about a group of people that is bound together by some sort of shared thinking. And this shared thinking is often developed by a common experience that they all uniquely hold. Okay, so that's that generational cohort. Right now, we hear a lot about millennials versus boomers and this current kind of okay boomer mentality of millennials telling the boomers to move over. It's interesting to me because when we think about the age of the baby boomers, we're talking about people in their late 50s to early to mid 70s. Those people often are holding high positions of power inside of powerful corporations that have a lot of both financial resources and social influence. The millennials, who are now the oldest of the millennials, are in their 40s and do not necessarily like being called millennial. The millennial generation was defined by being born into technology. And so this is a cohort of people that never knew life without technology being a part of it. Between those two, we have the Gen Xers. I am a Gen Xer. I was born in 1973. So I'm squarely in the middle of Generation X. The interesting thing about Gen X, and I've found this to be fascinating during the OK Boomer movement, is nobody talks about Gen X. Those of us that are currently in our mid 40s to late 40s, early 50s, nobody really talks about us. And it makes sense with what defined Generation X. The reason the X was chosen the Xing out is that it was a generation that was really defined by fear and neglect. This was the first generation of children to largely come home with the latchkey kids, the key hidden outside the house or the key in their pocket where both parents were working. So there was a lot of the first generation of unsupervision. When you look up Generation X, you find that they're defined by the advent of MTV, is actually this idea that television became the babysitter of Generation X, and that there's really no other defining characteristics. The social elements of fear were that of the Cold War and HIV and AIDS, and this idea of being afraid of politics and sexuality because of not knowing what these things meant defined a generation. So it's kind of fascinating for me as a Gen Xer to see this pushback between the baby boomers and millennials. And I just kind of sit in the middle going, we're here too. Gen Z was identified late in the millennial stage. There was this question mark of where the millennials would end and when something else would begin. The founding of Gen Z being in 1997 was really a recognition of not just increased types of technology and social media, but also 9/11. So my daughter was born in 1997. Early in 1997, in January. So when September 11th, 2001 happened, she has vague recollections of seeing the news, but she really doesn't have any memory of life before 9/11. She doesn't know what it was like to travel and go through airport security or the discussions of what terrorism was before 9/11 or fear from terrorism or fear of a new terrorist attack. She doesn't remember life before that. She only remembers life as it now exists in a post 9/11 world. Now, there is a new generation that has been identified. It was originally coined the Alpha generation, but now that's been kind of moved to Generation A, an obvious choice after Z, going back to A. These are children who were born 2013 to the present. I have the question mark after 2025 because that is now becoming kind of a loose marker of what is probably going to be the end of the Alpha generation and move into a generation after that, which is yet to be named. There's also a lot of discussion in the scholarship of what that A actually means. There was and is discussion that the A stands for activist because many of these children are being raised by millennials and even younger millennials who are raising kids who are very active in nature for social change. There are other scholars that talk about it being generation angry because of the change of social times and lack of jobs and awareness of social inequality. And even those who talk about generation ambivalent or aloof, which is an impact of the shift to remote learning and not having as much social contact. But all of those things will be formalized when we move into knowing what the next generational cohort would be. As a generational theorist, I would hypothesize that much like Gen Z was defined by those who did not know life prior to 9/11, the generation after Gen A will be those who do not remember life prior to COVID and this pandemic because it has now become a generationally defining event. So when we think about how this is going to impact workers, right? We're in organizational communication. What is going to change? How is that going to impact those children going to work? Even Gen Z, the late Gen Zs that aren't currently at work full time. So my daughter was born at the beginning of Gen Z. She'll be 25 this winter. She's a few years into her professional career, teaching fourth grade, currently dealing with remote learning like every other teacher in America. But the younger Gen Zs, like many of you here, are still in college. Will you go into work expecting flexibility in your work schedule and work from home options outside of a pandemic? It's a really interesting question, and one that will be pushed forward by the expectations of Gen Z and the leadership of millennials and Gen X workers as the baby boomers move closer and closer to retirement and having less of a say and push in what work means. So there's some common characteristics of organizations. And again, this is foundational. We're setting the stage here, and we're going to dig into these things deeper as we move on through this class. First, there are rules in every organization. These can be both formal and informal. Formal meaning they're written down, informal meaning they're told to you, but there are still consequences if you break the rule. If you want to think about rules in an organization, it's what are you told during your onboarding, during your orientation? What are the rules of this organization? Which differs by norms. Norms are behaviors that are accepted and even expected by most people inside the organization, but they're not actually a rule. They're not actually a rule. Now, over time, and with people in positions of power paying attention to what's going on, a norm may become a rule, but there is the difference between the two. The example I'll use for UCF is this idea of what a mixed mode class means, especially pre-pandemic. There was this thing in the air that a mixed mode class is at least 30% face-to-face and at least 30% online, and then the teacher has the flexibility. That is not a rule. That might have been a normative behavior that most people expected, that in a mixed mode class, you would have that mix of face-to-face and online learning. But now during this pandemic, some of that is being worked to formalize into rules, even as we see there are now these two new types of mixed mode of flex versus live. If you're confused by that, don't worry about it, because your faculty was confused by it as well. And it is still a rule that is in process, and we'll find out where it goes. This is largely impacted by hierarchy, meaning that people of different status, where they fall within the hierarchy, are able to formalize rules, formalize norms, and create that structure. Similarity refers to the fact that inside of organizations, you tend to have people that are kind of the same mind. They're headed in the same direction. This speaks to a lot of like goals and norms. And if you've ever found yourself working at a job for a paycheck, but said, these are not my people, you may have found that you did not have similar things in common. If that is too problematic inside of an organization where there are very different goals and objectives in different units, it can cause organizational chaos. Networks refer to who talks to whom. Is there a liaison person or a point person in different departments? Who do you go to for this? I know this is a common complaint I hear from UCF students is, I call this number and I'm sent to this number and I'm sent to this office and I just don't know who to talk to. But there is a network, and there are people that are required to stay in their lane so that they don't impact the work and lane of another person. So, for example, I am not an advisor. I can talk to you about courses, but I need to send you to advising because that is the network in which your audit is looked at and the College of Sciences decides if you're qualified to graduate. These rules, norms, and shared beliefs all come together to create culture. And later on in this class, we'll talk more about corporate culture, and we're also going to talk about the process of culture shifting. What do you do and what can you do if you have the desire to shift and change culture inside of an organization, which surely can change over time. And all of this brings us to the definition of what organizational communication is and setting us up for our next unit of looking at the history and theory that got us here. So just like gendered communication is communication where someone's sex or gender impacts your communication with or about them, organizational communication is every type of communication, verbal and nonverbal, that exists inside of an organization that stimulates meaning inside of the person you're communicating with. Which is why I chose this image of what is maybe a Zoom meeting or a Microsoft Teams meeting. I'm not really sure. It's generic in nature. This idea of having cameras on, being able to hear back from your listener, whether it's in person or remote, is helpful and important because the nonverbal feedback helps the speaker know if their message is being received. So that is where we start, and we will go on this very interesting and hopefully informative journey together to start to break down and understand the scientific structure of what makes up not only an organization, but the importance of the communication inside of it.